I'm Noah Abrams, and welcome to The Days Between, the show where I talk to my friends, people I admire, and people I want to better understand about success, failure, happiness, and misery, as well as all the other elements that make up a life well lived. Along the way, we'll look at mental, spiritual, and physical health, and when life didn't go as planned, the steps they took to get themselves from A to B and beyond. This week, I'm speaking with Nic Harcourt. When it comes to DJs, few, if any, have had more of an impact on popular culture than Nic. The confluence of his taste, audience, and the gift of timing have enabled him to soundtrack film, television, commercials, and beyond. As host of some of the world's most influential radio programs, listeners have been treated to a daily playlist of Nic's favorite songs for more than 30 years. With a personal history as eclectic as his musical palate and an appreciation having evolved into playing, music has been a constant during what has at times been a very chaotic existence. Nic's career has spanned the globe, but it was Los Angeles where he would ultimately settle, participating in nearly every facet of the music business in a hustle to make ends meet. During the course of our conversation, we discussed his struggles with alcoholism, spinning records with Michael Cain, and why success no longer has anything to do with what he does for a living. It is my pleasure to present the man who introduced me to Interpol, Nic Harcourt, on The Days Between. So I am here in Los Angeles, California with Nic Harcourt. You know, it's funny, you are so synonymous with Southern California, but you are not from here.
No, I'm not. You might have picked up an accent. I mean, my accent it's a bit of a mix at this point, but I'm from Birmingham in England originally. And if I was talking like I was from Birmingham, I'd be talking a little bit like that. You all right, are you? But then I spent some time in Australia. G'day, how you going? And then I've been in the States since 1988, 10 years in Woodstock, New York, and then 25 plus years in Los Angeles. It's scary.
Tell me about life in Birmingham.
So that's where I was born. That's my hometown. It's smack in the middle of England, in the Midlands, about 100 miles north of London and about 60 miles south of Manchester, 70 or 80 miles south of Liverpool, I think, something like that. And it's a town that exists purely because of trade. When it was, established some time way back when, nobody really knows the origin. They think that Birmingham actually means Birm and his family. That's the one that I got when I was a kid. We think it might mean this. Some guy called Birm lived here with his family. But it's the industrial Midlands. It's where the Industrial Revolution started. Not in Birmingham exactly, but around that area, an area that became known and is still called the Black Country. And it's called the Black Country because it was so dirty from all the coal that was being burned at the time to manufacture things. The car industry, the auto industry was based around Birmingham. There's not that much of it left. So an industrial blue-collar city is where I was born and grew up.
Did your parents work in those industries or?
No, my dad was a journalist. My dad was actually from London, Nic Harcourt. He passed away a couple of years ago. And he started as a copy boy in, working in a newspaper. And he worked for Ian Fleming, who at that time, when my dad was born in 1930, I think. So late 40s or something, 15, 16, mid 40s, I guess, after the Second World War. He fetched copy and tea for Ian Fleming, who, as well as writing James Bond books and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, also wrote columns for a newspaper. It's a newspaper that's long gone, I think. But so my dad was a journalist, and my mom worked in an electrical wholesaling company. And for people who are under 40, an electrical wholesaling company was where electricians and contractors used to go to buy what they needed to go do their jobs, factories, homes, or whatever, cable, whatever they needed. There were no Home Depots at the time. So my mom worked in a company that supplied electrical stuff for the for the building industry. So she came out of school, I think, and worked there as a telephonist. Is that right? Telephonist? Is that somebody who answers phones? I don't know what they used to call them. Maybe a transcriber, where they used to put those things on their heads. There's a name for those machines. There was a machine that, your boss would record what he wanted you to type. I think it was a telephonist. I don't know. Anyway, so my mom worked in an office, and she spent her whole career in that business and ended up running, one of those companies in that business. So my parents came from blue-collar families. They were, post-war babies. And so they were the first generation of any of their families to enter the middle class, I guess.
What kind of kid were you?
Well, my parents split up when I was about 8. And prior to that, my dad really wasn't around that much. He was a journalist. He was busy. He was traveling. He was in television at that point. And so as a kid under the age of 8, I was probably just like a normal kid who went to school and hung out with grandparents maybe once in a while and had some friends in the neighborhood. When they split up, things changed, obviously, as they do. And I lived with my mom for a while in the sort of remainder of my teenage years.
I've heard a story that when your mother told you that your father was going to go live someplace else, your first question was, did he leave the Beatles records?
I know, it's weird, isn't it? I mean, it says a lot, really. My dad and I didn't have a great relationship. I'm still trying to figure that out, but I'm okay with it at this point. Even though he didn't give me much, the stuff that he gave me was a lot. And he gave me the Beatles because he brought home promo records, which at the time was 7-inch singles. So when I was a kid, they would be playing the Beatles, and we had all the Beatles fucking records, And somehow in my kid brain, when she told me he wasn't going to be there when we came back from this weekend trip, that's what came out. Did he leave the Beatles records? I don't remember it. She told me that, but it's a weird one.
And so there was music playing in your house then, pretty consistently.
The only thing I remember is the Beatles, because it's a long time ago. I mean, both of my parents loved Sinatra, and I remember Sinatra after then. I don't remember Sinatra being played around the house when I was 6. I remember the Beatles being played around the house when I was 6, because that's what they were excited about, because they were 30 or, in their late 20s when the Beatles arrived. And so that was an exciting time for them. And I remember the vibe, I remember their excitement about the Beatles, because it's 1962 or 63. And it's hard for people who weren't around at that time to understand. But when the Beatles arrived, the world fucking changed for these people, the war babies, post-war babies. The world changed in such a significant way. So the only music I really remember around the house at that age was the Beatles. But then, obviously a little bit later on, when I was living with my mom, I would know the music that she would listen to. When I would visit my dad, I would know the music that he would listen to. And for my dad, it was either big band music or Sinatra. And of course, big band and Sinatra was the music he listened to as a teenager, which is a trip when you think about it.
When did you start exploring music outside of what your parents were listening to?
My mom got remarried to a guy who was not a good guy. And I'll answer any questions about it if you want to ask them. But for now, I'll just tell you she was married to a guy who was not a good guy. And life got very complicated. And I ended up going away to school, to boarding school, because the adults just couldn't get their shit together. And that was when I started to discover my own music. And that was when I started to pay attention to what was on the charts. So I was like 12, 13, something like that. And that's when I really started to take notice of what was going on around me. And that's when I discovered the music that was mine. I mean, the Beatles are mine as well, but they were given to me. Everything that came after that, I found myself.
At what point did it go from an appreciation in listening to music to the desire to play music?
So I didn't play, I sang. I tried to learn guitar a couple of times when I was probably 14 when I got the first one, but I was never any good and I always quit, basically. So this is too fucking hard. But then I was sitting around, you know, in a pub as you do in England with a couple of friends one night when we were like 19 or 20. And my one friend, Dickie, says to my other friend, Steve, hey, let's put a band together. And I said, I'll sing. You know, we're all drinking pints of beer or something. And we did that sort of on and off for a couple of years. And then it went the way most bands do. And most people who are in a band don't pursue it more than a couple of years. It's just something you do when you're that age. I mean, I was serious about it in the time that we were doing it. But, you know, we're very young and we had to get real lives, you know, so it went by the by. I mean, years later, I ended up coming back to the guitar. But at the time when I was a kid, no, it was too difficult. And so I sang in this band. Fortunately, there are no recordings available. I have a couple, but they will remain under lock and key forever.
Now, was it just one band?
It was two bands. First band was called Bloop 79, because that was the year we did it. So I must have been 21. And then that sort of mutated into a band called the Cassettes, which mutated into a band called Red Cassette. So that was the one band, and that was the serious one, as serious as we could be. And then a year later, I was in another band called Decadence for half an hour, something like that. We did a couple of gigs.
Now, how did you end up in Australia?
So I got married when I was 19. And I look back at it now, and I think I was lonely, you know, and I wanted to be with somebody. And I'd had a couple of girlfriends, and then I met this one girl, and we got married, and it was a mistake. I mean, getting married at 19 is dumb, you know? But nobody told me it was dumb, so I went ahead and did it, and I probably would have done anyway. And we were together a couple of years. The band was sort of happening simultaneously there for a while. But I was also working. I was working in a concrete factory. I was making pretty good money. But I was not a happy person at the time. I was also an active alcoholic. I'm still an alcoholic, but I'm not active right now. So it was a miserable sort of time, to be honest with you. My early 20s were kind of miserable. And so when that relationship ended, something in me said there's got to be more than this. You know, I wasn't living in Birmingham at that time. I actually, where I went to school was about 20 miles outside of Birmingham in a place called Lichfield. And when I left school, I moved there because that's where my friends were that I'd grown up and gone to school with. But there was a lot of change going on in my life, and I wanted to see what else there was in the world. So I went to Greece. I quit my job and I went to Greece, and I was there a couple of months. And then I was working cleaning greenhouses. I was working on boats. And then the guy I was traveling with, we decided to go to Turkey. We actually wanted to go to India, but we didn't have enough money. So Turkey's right next door to Greece, as you probably know. So we went from Greece to Turkey, and I met an Australian girl while I was in Istanbul. And I traveled around a little bit more, came back to Istanbul. She was still there. We decided that we would go back to England together. So she and I went back to England together, and we moved to London. We moved in. We got jobs, and she decided she wanted to go home. She was homesick, and I was in love. So we got married, and my second marriage, and I moved to Australia with this girl, Sue. I was 25, and seemed like a good idea at the time.
And how long were you in Australia?
I was in Australia about 5.5 years. So no band. The music was different. This is pre-internet, obviously, when every territory had its own unique music scene. And I arrived in Australia in 1983. Wow, 40 years ago this year. And because I've always loved music, I sort of took notice of what was going on around me. And that became the music then that I was into, because that was the music that I was hearing. I wasn't hearing chart stuff from England anymore. Even getting music magazines was really difficult. You know, it was really difficult 40 years ago to stay in touch. If you went to Australia from England, you might as well be on fucking Mars. $2 a minute to make phone calls home, you know, get drunk and get homesick. That's a week's wages gone. But I had this life in Australia. I got into sales. I had a sales career, blagged my way into selling shit. And I worked for a telephone answering service company, selling telephone answering services. Then I worked for Honeywell for a while. So I had this sort of 5.5 year life in Australia. But that's also where I hit my alcoholic bottom, first one.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
My alcoholic bottom?
Yeah.
I started drinking when I was about 14. Life was not very happy being away at boarding school at that time in my life. And I loved alcohol. Alcohol was my friend. And so I, very quickly developed a habit, so to speak. There were other things around as well, but alcohol has always been my drug of choice. And I was a fucking full-on drunk for, that chunk of time from probably 14 till 30 when I got sober. The first time, 31 when I got sober the first time. And I don't really know what to say. You say, tell me about it. Drunks do stupid things. I did a lot of stupid things. I was a really unhappy kid and an unhappy teenager and an unhappy young man. But when I got to Australia, I mean, they can drink in England, but fuck, they can drink in Australia too. And I mean, I just went for it. So even though I sort of had this little career in sales and I was married and I had a life for all intents and purposes, I don't look back at that time as a mistake, but I certainly look back on it as a time, like 5.5 years of my life where I guess I just needed to hit the bottom that I needed to hit. And alcoholics blow their lives up. It's one thing we all do. And, everything just got to a point where it just couldn't keep going, I got fired from a job. I crashed a car. I left my relationship and I moved to America. Yay.
Where'd you move to?
Well, the funny thing about it is I got sober here. I got sober within 3 weeks. I moved to Woodstock, the Woodstock, the town that gave its name to the festival, although the festival was never there. The original 1969 festival was in Bethel, which is in New York State, but further south than Woodstock. I moved to Woodstock because I had a friend who had been in a band back in, in my community in Litchfield, somebody I knew who was a good friend who'd had a band and had a deal and was now working in Woodstock with a couple of other people on a band that, they had some money invested or whatever. They never ended up releasing that record, but I went to Woodstock. I didn't move to Woodstock, actually. When I left Australia, I bought a round-the-world ticket because I thought, well, maybe I'll come back. I'd met a girl. I'd broken up with the relationship, but I'd met a girl in Sydney. I lived in Brisbane, by the way, in Australia, in Queensland. But I met a girl in Sydney just before I left who I really liked a lot. And I was like, oh, maybe I'll come back. But, I have been back, but I didn't go back on that round-the-world ticket. I went to Woodstock because I had a friend who was there. And I do remember within the first day or two of being there, being in the Tinker Street Cafe, which was the only music venue in town at the time. And actually my first unofficial job was, being a bouncer there, which is pretty funny because you look at me, I'm 5'7" and shrinking. But I went to Woodstock and I met somebody who said, so where are you from? What are you doing? Who are you? What's your thing? And I sort of shared what I've just told you, essentially. And she said, oh, you're staying. You'll be here a while. And apparently it is that kind of a town where people think they're traveling through, but they end up staying. I ended up staying 10 years. And I got into radio there. So I got sober there within a month. I thought it'd be a cool place to get fucked up. It's like Woodstock, man. And I got there and I met a girl who was sober, who gently suggested that, maybe I had a problem and I was ready, I'd just been so beaten up by life and choices that I'd made as an alcoholic that I was ready. And I got sober, and I stayed sober a long time. And we can talk about that some more if you want to. But I went to Woodstock, I got sober, and I got a career.
Tell me about WDST.
WDST Radio Woodstock is the local station in Woodstock. And I was staying with a friend in a studio, actually. And I had all these cassettes and CDs. CDs were new at the time. But I had all these cassettes and CDs of these bands that my friend had never heard of. And they were bands like Midnight Oil, In Excess, Crowded House, some other bands that people might not know, like Mental as Anything, the Hoodoo Gurus. There was just all this music that I'd gotten into when I lived there, and I had my music collection with me. And my friend said, why don't you go down to the local radio station and see? They're really cool down there. They do all sorts of different programs. Maybe they give you a job doing an Australian show. So I went to the station, which was located in a house, because that's what these small town radio stations are like. And I met the program director there, and I told him who I was. And he said, so do you have a work permit? And I was like, huh? He's like, well, I'd love to give you, an hour doing an Australian show on a Sunday night, but you have to have a work permit. And I was like, oh, no, I hadn't really thought about that, because I really hadn't. I hadn't thought about working. I got a little bit of money when I got here, some savings or whatever. So they actually, and I can't remember what the process was called, but the radio station actually applied for a permit for me to work there, and it was turned down. I'd been up there maybe a year at that point. So they said no, and they wrote me a letter saying no, and by the way, be out of the country in 21 days. And so I married my girlfriend, who was also the person who'd taken me to my first AA meeting, and then I got a work permit. Later on, I got citizenship and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I essentially got married so that I could work. And I never did the Australian show, but I did end up working there part-time. And I was really, really lucky that I was able to find this career somewhere where the station was very highly regarded, even though it was a small station. The thing about Woodstock is that because it's only a couple of hours north of New York City, there's a lot of sort of weekenders, and, there's a lot of towns like that around the country, little cool towns that are adjacent to big cities or closer to big cities. So the weekend audience for this radio station was a lot of people from New York. So the station had a little more clout and importance within the industry because of the people who listened to it. Not unlike KCRW, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I got to learn my craft. I got to learn how to do radio, learn how to do interviews, learn how to program. And over the period of time I was there, which was, I think I was in Woodstock for 9.5 years, and I was probably on the radio for about 8 of those years, maybe 8 and a bit. I started off as an overnight filling guy and then became a weekend guy. And then I tried to move to California for a couple of months. That didn't work out. I went back. I ended up being the news guy. I was the news director there back in the days of rip and read, which was when news would come in on a telex or a fax, and you just rip it off, and that was the news. I did the news there in the morning, and then I ended up doing the morning show, and then I ended up being the music director, and then I ended up running the whole place. So I became the program director. So my time there, Woodstock is a really special, important decade of my life. Not just because I got a career there, but because I got sober and I met somebody, and my life started to look a little less unhappy, for the first time. So that period in my life is, it's a long time ago now, but it informs, a lot of what I do today in my work and in my life. It was a really important time.
How did you end up at KCRW?
So I'd been obviously at DST, and that relationship I was in had broken up, but I was still in Woodstock. And I'd gotten, I think, after a couple of years of doing it, I think I'd gotten pretty good at what I was doing. The Woodstock 94 festival came through just about 8 miles away. They actually did it in a town called Saugerties, so the Woodstock 94 festival was actually pretty close to Woodstock. And we were the official station on site for this festival. So, when I was talking to you earlier on about weekenders coming up who would hear me on the air, we had the world in our backyard for a weekend. And I had a lot of people approaching me about working in other towns, people who were in Woodstock for the week or the month or whatever, set up for this festival or just over the weekend. I almost took a job in New York, which didn't happen because the program director got fired. One of those things where you get offered a job and then you're, oh, I'm so excited. And then the guy who offered you the job's gone. It's not the only time that's happened to me in my life. But I got the urge to go bigger, that much as I loved where I was, and I really loved where I was, I wanted more. It's a thread through my life of always feeling that once you've sort of accomplished something, then what's next? There has to be something else. And I was really comfortable with what I was doing. I was really good at it. I thought New York, I thought Boston. And then one day I got a call from somebody who was, have you ever thought of moving to LA? And it was somebody who worked in the industry who knew that KCRW was looking for a new host for their flagship music program, Morning Becomes Eclectic, which had been hosted by a couple of people over the years. But the guy who did it before me had been pretty successful at it, a guy called Chris Doritas. And so this is 1998. And I was asked, would you be interested in applying for this job? Because I think you'll get it. I didn't know at the time that they'd already been looking for 6 months and they hadn't found who they wanted. And they were starting to get a little desperate because they'd made such a big deal locally about, well, we're going to scour the planet to find the next guy. And 6 months later, they hadn't. And then they found me, and obviously I was capable. I came out, I auditioned on the air by doing the show for a week on the air, and then they offered me the job, and I was shocked. I mean, I didn't think I was going to get the job. I just thought, oh, I'll go to LA for a week, that'll be fun, and I really hadn't thought about it. But yeah, I mean, somebody suggested I apply for the job. I came to LA, and I got it, and life changed again.
Just to sidetrack for a second, for the people that aren't familiar with how radio worked at the time. WDST was a commercial station, correct?
It was.
KCRW was not a commercial station.
Correct.
Can you explain the difference?
Commercials? I mean, essentially, commercial radio, we all know. It depends on where you live and what stations you listen to. But in general, commercial radio is, either talk, music, or news, and 10 to 12, 15 minutes of commercials every hour. That's what supports the station. Non-commercial radio, public radio, as it's called in the States, is very different. The station's licenses are usually held by institutions. So KCRW's license is held by Santa Monica Community College. The station I work at now, I still do a radio show in Northridge, is KCSN, and that's California State University. And Northridge owns the license. So a lot of the licenses, not all of them, but a lot of the licenses are owned by institutions. And the stations have to support themselves. So they are allowed to do underwriting, which is kind of like a commercial, but it's usually read by the DJ or the host instead of like some, really weird commercial with all the bells and whistles. And then they're supported by pledge drives, which is done in public broadcasting in the US, whether it's public radio or public television, where they ask their listeners or their viewers to contribute to the station to financially support the station. So it's really different, obviously.
Creatively, though, how is the music different and what's being played?
Well, I can only talk about the places that I've worked. KCRW was pretty unique in so much as it had, and still does, block programming. Most radio stations have a format, right? So you have your top 40 commercial radio station, or your classic rock commercial radio station, or your hip-hop station, et cetera, et cetera. Alternative rock, which is where I sort of started over at WDST, or modern rock as it was called at the time. And then in public radio, it's usually jazz, classical, news, or AAA. AAA originally stood for a mix of album rock, adult rock, and alternative rock. Most stations have that as a format. So KCSN has it as a format. WXPN in Philadelphia has that as a format. WFUV in New York has that format. But it's only music. KCRW had block programming, which meant that they would have blocks of different types of programming. So there would be music in the morning, news and current affairs in the afternoon, music at night, and then in the early morning, news again. So they switched around a lot between music and news. So it's really different. I don't know if there's any other public station like that. And it's really hard to program a radio station like that as well, because you have different audiences. One of the genius things about the general manager of KCRW when I was there, she's retired a long time ago now, Ruth Seymour, is that she understood, and this is 25, 30 years ago, she understood that if you could bring a younger audience in with the music, that maybe they'd stick around for the news. And so the programming at KCRW when I was there and before I was there was really very much a free-form way of programming. The DJ picked their own music, obviously. And because we're in Los Angeles, I mean, again, it's the audience. I mean, this is a town full of movers and shakers. This is a town with people who run movie studios, who direct movies, who write movies, who act in television shows. Los Angeles is a company town. This town functions and exists around the entertainment business. And because of the music that we were playing on that radio station, we had a very big impact on how music was used in entertainment. So during the 10 years that I was there, I would say that we, whoever, pretty much soundtracked Hollywood, because all those movers and shakers, pre-internet, pre-Pandora, pre-Spotify, were listening to the radio show that I hosted and making creative choices and decisions about how they used music in film and television from that show. I mean, we had an outsized impact, I think, on what was going into movies and TV shows and commercials for a good decade. But the thing about your question was what's different about them. The real difference is commercials or not commercials. But because public radio is supported by the people listen to it, they're usually prepared to take a few more chances than commercial radio. Because if the audience supports it, then you can keep doing it. And one of the things that we did at KCRW was not conform to any particular format of music. When I did my show there in the morning, I would go in, to the music library in the morning before I went on the air, and I'd pull maybe, this is pre everything being digital, I'd pull maybe 20 or 30 CDs that I'd think that maybe there were songs on there that I'd want to play that day. And then I would go into the studio and I would just put a radio show together. And every now and then I'd dash back in and grab something else because there was an idea that was triggered by a particular song that I was playing. Oh, wouldn't that sound good with whatever? So it was a free-form radio show. And again, I was very lucky to work at a place for a decade where they pretty much let me do what I wanted to do, as long as I was successful, as long as the audience supported the programming during pledge drives, then I was allowed to do whatever I wanted to do pretty much. So it was a decade where we innovated a lot. We took the station out of the station. We took it to New York. We took it to Seattle. We took it to London, the morning show. And just really created, I think, a place in Los Angeles where new music could be heard, because you couldn't buy us. Do you know what I mean? I remember once a guy saying to me, a good friend who was in the record industry, saying, "Oh, you've got a reputation as being unworkable." And in my immediate reaction to that was, that's bad, right? I was like, "Oh no." And he was like, "No, that's really good." Because you couldn't just come and say, "Hey man, play this record. We'll buy you some T-shirts for your next whatever," which is what they do in commercial radio. I'd be like, no, we play it if we want to. We play it if we like it. And so because of that, I think the show, and I can only talk about that show during the decade I was there, but during that time, I think we had a reputation of a place, a show, a 3-hour block of radio in the morning in Los Angeles. And it's always drive time in Los Angeles, where people could hear new music, unexpected music, and also know that it was being programmed by somebody who had nothing to gain apart from playing the music he liked.
As someone who spent many mornings with you during your time there, I'm curious, where did the live in-studio performances come from?
Well, that was there before I was. You know, I didn't create this show. It was there before me. It's still there. Every host has their moment, I guess. But the live performances had always been there before I was there anyway. And basically what that meant was that 3 or 4 days a week, sometimes 5, we would have a guest, usually a band, a live performer, sometimes just an interview, a guest DJ or something like that, which was a lot of fun because then you can talk to anybody. I mean, I had Michael Cain in there as a guest DJ. It's one of the greatest half an hours of radio in my life, you know, with him picking his favorite music. But the live performances, basically it was like the last 45 minutes of the show. So around about 11:15. The show was from 9 till noon, and around 11:15, 11:20 every morning, 3 or 4 mornings a week, we would have a live band. And in many cases, bands that had never been on the air anywhere before. Certainly not in Los Angeles, and in many cases not in America. Obviously, I am English, and I do like English music, but I like a lot of American music as well. But I was seen as an outlet for British music. Oh, he's British, he'll probably get it.
Well, there's a very large British band that you put on the air for the first time in the United States.
Yeah. So one of my favorite bands of the late 90s was Travis, Scottish band. And I remember having them on Morning Becomes Eclectic in 98 or 99, very early on in my time in Los Angeles. And at that time, they were the biggest band in the UK. They had that song, Why Does It Always Rain on Me, which was a massive hit. And I remember them coming in, and I just loved those guys. They were so much fun. And, you know, they came back a year later or something, and they came in as guest DJs, Fran Healy and Dougie Payne, I think, the bass player. And they pulled a CD. Dougie pulled a CD out of his pocket, his back pocket. He said, you got to take a listen to this. This is just about to blow up in England. And it was a broken CD. He put it in his back pocket without a case. And it was broken, but it was Coldplay. So Travis should for always get the credit of breaking Coldplay in America, because they gave me that. Now, it was broken, but I went and got an import copy of it. And we started playing Coldplay. I mean, look, they blew up pretty quick. It wasn't like we were out there playing it on our own for a year before anything happened. It was maybe a couple of months at most. And then K-Rock, which was the big commercial station in LA, started playing it, and it blew up from there. But Coldplay's very first airplay in Los Angeles was on KCRW, and Coldplay's very first live performance in the United States was on Morning Becomes Eclectic, which I'm very proud of. They came in for their first gig in the States, which was the K-Rock Christmas show that night on a Saturday night. And before they did that, they came and they taped a session for us for Morning Becomes Eclectic. There was a lot of great music being made in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I played it. And I played it because I could. And a lot of that music did go on to break. There's a long list of artists. Coldplay's the biggest, obviously, although Adele's pretty big too. And we played her first, and she came on my show twice in that first year. I loved her so much the first time. They came to us a couple of months later and said, so Adele's back in town. Would you like to do her again? I was like, yep. But because I had the freedom to play what I wanted, I didn't have to think about, oh, is the audience going to like that? I mean, does that go with that song? It was just like, I like it. Fuck it. Let's play it, you know? Norah Jones is a big one as well, because she came into the station with Charlie Hunter, the bass player, and she'd done a couple of songs on his record. It was before she'd released anything, and she sort of sat in the corner just singing on this song of Charlie Hunter. And I was like, wow, she's amazing. And she had an EP at the time, which hadn't been released. It was just something they were sort of giving to people. And we would do a fundraising show every year. And I remember Nora coming on with Charlie Hunter and saying to her, hey, so we're doing this thing at the end of the year. Would you be interested in opening? And it was 6 months later, and she came back and she was the headliner. That was a pretty good one. But I remember playing her music on that first album on the radio and going, I don't really know if this fits. And usually when I had that response to something, it meant I should be playing it, you know? I mean, if I listen to something, I'm like, there's no fucking way I'm playing that, then that's that. But if I have something where I'm like, I don't know, this is pretty weird, this is pretty different. I mean, not that her stuff was weird, but it was very different. I mean, jazz was not being played on the radio, that kind of jazz, unless it was, like jazz radio stations or whatever. And yeah, she blew up, man. She came back. I mean, I looked like a genius. I mean, I really did. I booked her and was like, yeah, maybe you'll open this thing for us in 6 months. And she seriously came back, with 9 Grammys and headlined the show.
How does that feel, though, for you when you see that? Because it wasn't like that just happened once. I mean, it happened multiple times. And part of it probably was the audience. A lot of it was you. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, I think, was probably the timing.
Yeah, it was the timing for all of those things. It was the timing when the music was released. It was the timing that I happened to have a radio show where I could play whatever the fuck I wanted. And it was a time where, again, pre-internet, where anybody who was hungry for discovery in music in Los Angeles was listening to this radio show. So that's a confluence of, all those things coming together at the same time. And me, my sensibility, whatever that is, being in Los Angeles at that time, when that music was being released and having the opportunity to play it. I mean, I do have good taste. I mean, that's how this shit happened, and it's not something that I used to talk about a lot, but I look back on that now and I'm like, well, yeah, look, I mean, clearly, you can pick a hit.
In November of 2008, you announced that you were leaving Morning Becomes Eclectic. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned earlier on in this conversation, my life has gone through these cycles where, as an alcoholic, I have blown my life up a couple of times. When I got sober in Woodstock, and I got this career, and my life got really good. That included the time I moved to LA and doing the show, and the show blew up. It was already doing well before I got there, but when I got there, it really blew up. And the internet actually had something to do with that, because people could listen to us in other countries, and in other parts of this country. We had a substantial audience in New York. We had a substantial audience in San Francisco. Right at the time that everything in my life looked really good, I drank. And I was like 15, 16 years sober, and I drank. And for anybody who's listening to this who, has an alcoholic in their lives, they know exactly what I'm talking about. And for anybody who's listening to this who is an alcoholic, you probably know what I'm talking about as well. It's what we fucking do. Alcoholics and drug addicts break shit. We blow shit up. I'm sober again now, but when I drank back then, it would have been the beginning of 2006. By the time I got to 2008, things were a mess in my personal life. I had a partner who I'd moved out to Los Angeles with. We had kids. I left. I started drinking, and shit got messed up. I think essentially what happened was, and I'm taking some long pauses in this that you may well edit out because they are long, but there are still things around that I'm not comfortable with sharing. And the long pause is because I'm actually thinking about it and thinking, no, it's not this is not the time or the venue to do that. But suffice it to say that it didn't end well. And it was time for things to change. It was time for things to change. And it was a huge, huge change in my life. And as I said, everything else was fucked up. So in my experience as an alcoholic, when things break, they all break at the same time. And so it was a big change. Big change.
Well, you went to a different station.
Well, so initially, no. So what happened was I stepped away from Morning Becomes Eclectic, but I carried on doing a Sunday show, which I'd been doing there for 7 or 8 years. Sounds Eclectic, which was a syndicated version of the show. It was a different show, although we would take a session and sort of cut it and edit it and then build a 2-hour show around it. So I carried on doing that show for another 2 years and was doing other things and unfortunately drinking. And then the different station, which is out in the valley, which is where we're recording this today, the beautiful San Fernando Valley, I knew the guy who was running it at the time. They didn't really have any staff. They basically had just sort of changed format to just a sort of jukebox of AAA music. And I was asked if I'd be interested in doing a show. And I said, first of all, I live in the Valley. So yeah, that sounds like fun. I've only got one show now on Sundays. I was offered this show on Saturdays. And I went to the management at KCRW, which was now somebody different. It wasn't Ruth Seymour. It was the general manager who's there today. And said that I wanted to do this show on Saturdays and was told no. Like, if you want to do that, then you can't be here as well. And I think they were shocked when I said, well, I'll go work for the people who don't tell me what I can and can't do. So I quit.
But were you being paid for the other show?
I was being paid for the Sunday show at KCRW, you mean, or the one out in the Valley?
No, the new show.
No.
So you left a paying job.
I left a paying job, yeah.
To go work for free.
Yeah. Because fuck it. You know, when somebody says to me, you can't do that, I mean, I understand as if I'm a child and I'm putting my hand on the fucking hot stove, you take the fucking instructions, right? So it's not like I can't take, what's the word I'm looking for? Direction. I can take direction. But when somebody says to me in that work situation, why would you want to go and work for those people? This is the place. And I was like, well, why can't I do both? I mean, and that was really sort of like, a trickle down from what had happened 2 years before as well. So it just came to the point where I was just like, fuck it. No. And I think they were shocked. Totally shocked. And I do remember walking out of the building there. The station's in a different place now, but I remember walking out of the building and walking down that hallway that I'd walked in for 10 fucking years, and I felt like I was throwing a Molotov cocktail behind me. It was just like, set it on fire. So yeah, burned that bridge, which is fine. And ended up getting this other gig where I still work. But since I stepped away from the full-time gig at KCRW, I've done so many things in the last couple of decades. 2008, so 15 years. Wow, it's 15 years ago. It's been a long time. So there's been a lot of other stuff, and radio at this point in my life is one of the things that I do.
Tell me about Jump Circus.
So I talked earlier on about being in a band as a singer and not being able to play guitar or anything. Around about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, 11, 12 years ago, I decided it was time to learn how to play the guitar. It's like I'd always been intimidated and scared of it and didn't think I could. So I taught myself guitar. And I started writing songs. I didn't teach myself guitar to play Dylan covers. I taught myself to play guitar because I wanted to prove that I could. And then once I did, and I had those 3 chords or, whatever, I started writing some songs, and the first ones were really shit. And then I did a couple that were not. And then I was talking to a friend of mine, Gary Jules, who's the guy who had that huge hit with the Mad World cover from Donnie Darko. 20 years ago, actually, this Christmas, that was the number one single in England. That was the Christmas single. And I remember being in England and watching him on Top of the Pops performing it and being like, fuck, that's insane. You were playing the Sounds Eclectic evening at the Universal Amphitheater 6 months ago. You know, he opened, you know. But I was talking to Gary because we're friends, and he said, you should record these. Because he'd come over my house and I played him one of the songs or whatever. You should record these. And he suggested a friend, a guy called Ben Peeler, who is an amazing musician, specializes in slide and pedal steel. And I asked him if he would work with me to record the songs. And that's the project that became Jump Circus. Jump being because that's kind of what I do in my life. I jump. It's like when I moved to LA, I was really scared. I didn't really want to come, but I was like, fuck it, jump, you know? And then circus, because I mean, look, you know, I'm living in the circus. So Jump Circus, one word, folks. And there's 3 songs out there. I recorded 4. I've released 3 of them. There's another one that I just haven't gotten around to releasing. But it wasn't a project for anything other than to do it, you know? It was like, learn how to play the guitar, write some songs, and record them. And I haven't done any more since, because it's not the most important thing in my life. But at that time, I wanted to do that to prove to myself that I could do that.
How do you define success?
Wow, that came out of fucking left field. Today, I don't know. Success. What the fuck is success? I mean, there's success in business, there's success in your personal life, your private life. I think a lot of people, as they get older, the definition of, you know, things that are important to them, success or otherwise, changes. I'm 66 now, which is ridiculous because my granddad was 66. I don't feel it, but, you know, I've lived a good chunk of time. And so, you know, how I define things has changed based on my life experience. Success for me at this point in my life has nothing to do with what I do for a living. It's about how I interact with the people around me that I care about and who care about me, the people I love and the people who love me. So most of my energy these days, I worked in public radio, still work in public radio, so I didn't make a ton of money, you know? So most of my life these days is working to pay the bills like everybody else and keep a roof over my head. And I work in the entertainment industry, so that's not always easy. You know, I have a lot of freelance work. I do a morning show, but, you know, it's 3 or 4 hours a day. And then the rest of the time, I actually try to make real money, you know, because as I said, you know, not a lot of rich people from public radio. So success for me today is not about what I do for a living. It's about how I live my life.
Are you successful on your terms?
I am in the best place in my life that I've ever been in, personally. And I've got a lot of chaos around me, you know, just because life is chaotic. Well, I told you I have 2 20-year-old children. I have an ex. I have, you know, the things that you acquire through your life, you know, that can be complicated. And work is always, you know, I'm always hustling, working, getting a gig here, getting a gig there. But in my personal life and how I feel about myself, I'm good. I'm good. I got sober again almost 10 years ago. And so success for me is really being able to just, you know, pay the bills and show up for my partner and my kids.
How do you define failure?
Wow, these are such sort of simple questions when you think about it, but nobody's ever said to me, how do you define failure? So I'm going to have to think about it. I have failed many times at things that I've tried to do. I've failed in relationships. I've failed in jobs. But I don't know how to answer that question, to be quite honest with you. To define failure. I don't know. I don't know as I really can.
Can you name a personal or professional failure that ultimately set you up for success?
Well, as an alcoholic, I feel like a lot of the stuff that has not been successful or a failure probably has something to do with, how much I was drinking or not drinking at the time. It took me a long time to figure out how to be in a relationship. I have a great relationship. I've been with my partner 12 years. I mean, all the other failed relationships had to happen to get me there. And for anybody who cares, I define the success in my relationship today around the fact that I finally realized I just don't have to be right all the time. And I had to fail at those relationships until I finally got that. I was like, you don't have to be right, man. You don't have to be fucking right. But I think that comes with, experience. I think that just comes with time. So those failed relationships finally set me up for, being capable of being in one. Of course, I also have a partner who's also really fucking amazing. So that helps. But from the business point of view, I don't know, man. I've done a lot of different things before I got into this, and I've done a lot of different things in this career. And sometimes a gig is just a gig, But I think that it all ties into the personal shit for me, man. It's like if I'm not sober, then shit's not going to work out. It's just the way it's been, and I've experienced it many times. And if I look back at it, I've probably blown my life up like 4 times, and you just start again. But now that I'm sober a chunk of time and I sort of understand it a little bit better, I don't think I'm going to do that again, at least not today.
How do you define happiness?
Oh, man. Happiness is a fleeting thing, I find, when you recognize it, it's probably about to leave. When you're feeling happy and you're in that moment where you're like, wow, I'm happy. That's usually when it leaves, because you can't question it. Well, why am I happy now? Happiness for me is just being okay with who I am. That's enough. I shared a little bit of my backstory, obviously. And there was a lot of unhappiness around that. And today, I just appreciate the moments when they arrive, and try not to overthink it. When I talk to my kids about happiness, I just say, look, life is not about happiness. It comes and it goes, and if you can recognize it when it comes and appreciate it, then that's fucking great. And it might not come around again for a while, Sometimes we're happy, sometimes we're not. Sometimes we're depressed, sometimes we're not. For me, my evolution as a guy has been around trying to be okay with myself and, not act out and not fuck up.
What would you say to 18-year-old Nick?
Stop drinking. Stop now.
How would you describe what you do for a living?
I never thought of myself as a creative, but I do now, because people told me, no, you're a creative person. Oh, wow. Okay. So I guess I would define what I do as creative. I make things that didn't exist before, right? And it doesn't have to be like I invented a fucking, a new vacuum cleaner or something, but I put things together and create something that didn't exist, whether that's a radio show or a TV thing, or, I haven't done music supervision for a while, but, putting a great song on a scene in a movie, the stuff that I do is creating. It's creating things. So I guess that's the answer to the question.
Nic Harcourt, thank you for speaking with me.
Wow, that was quick. You're welcome.
The Days Between is a production of Noah Abrams Studio. Story editing by Andrew Henry. Mixing and mastering by Greg Henkin. Website and design by John Fisher. Theme music is by Evo. The Days Between can be found online at www.thedaysbetweenpodcast.com and on Instagram at The Days Between Podcast. My name is Noah Abrams. Thanks for listening.